Hello, and welcome to another episode of the American Compass podcast. I'm Drew Holden, managing editor at American Compass, and your guest host for today's conversation about the media. I'm joined by Emily Jashinsky, DC correspondent at UnHerd and host of the new show Afterparty on the MK Network, and Haisten Willis, editor at Commonplace, to talk about the American press and Donald Trump's pushback against them in his second term. We try to make sense of some of Trump's recent actions, like threatening broadcast licenses and filing lawsuits against media outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And we talk about the rise of new media and what it portends for media coverage from legacy outlets. But before we get into that, I need to tell you about what else we have going on this week at Commonplace. Truman Cunningham argues that higher ed should pursue a novel fix, turning to the Oxford tutorial model. Warren Cass has a piece on the latest about NVIDIA, about Jensen Huang's Chinese checkers. And Aaron Wren dives into New York City's rebound from COVID, and why the Big Apple has had more success than so many other cities across the country. So, go check all of those out, but here is my conversation with Emily Jashinsky and Haisten Willis. Emily Jashinsky, Haisten Willis, welcome to the American Compass podcast.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here, Drew.
We are talking today about something that is an issue that is near and dear to all of our hearts, the American media in the Donald Trump era. Mm-hmm. Emily, as the guest, Haisten and I are both at American Compass. I'll turn the mic to you first. One of the things that I think is important for our listeners and for readers kind of at home is when we talk about the media, what is it we're talking about? Who is the media? What are the subsections of the media?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're talking about the villains. No.
There are no outtakes, so we're going straight through.
No, of course. But no, I mean, it's always a fair point. When we talk about the media, that also, of course, includes Fox News. It also includes conservative media, places that all of us have worked, Washington Examiner, Washington Free Beacon, The Federalist. So that's all part of it, of course. But I actually am happy to make that distinction because I think even when you talk about the media and you paint with a broad brush with just those two words, I'm happy to include conservative media, which is increasingly powerful but still utterly dwarfed by the size and scope of what many people refer more narrowly to corporate media or legacy media. Fox, again, is a corporation. It is a very big corporation, unlike, for example, the Washington Examiner or the Free Beacon. The way those are organized doesn't really compete with the corporate structure of something like Fox or Disney and ABC, Paramount and CBS, and then you can include, MSNBC was spun off, but still into a pretty good-sized company. It's called Versant now. New York Times, big company. Washington Post, big company. So as powerful as I think it's fair to acknowledge conservative media is, I'm still perfectly comfortable talking about the media with a broad brush because it's still, I think, overwhelmingly dominated by legacy voices.
Yeah, and I think it's also what captures in people's minds as the media, right? Yes. Haisten, does that check out to you too?
Yeah, I feel like Emily's right here. The media can really mean almost anything. Even some people argue that someone just holding their phone, putting stuff on Twitter, if they're not getting paid for it, is still a member of the media. But really, when we say the media, don't we usually mean the bigger media, the ABC, Washington Post, places like that, right? And that's an important distinction to make. Who exactly we are really talking about here.
Yeah. And I think particularly in this conversation about how the media intersects with President Trump across his timeline in D.C., that it's most valuable to talk about the legacy media or the liberal media. The mainstream media, I think at least some people on the left would tend to call it.
Sure.
So I think I want to pull a little bit from both of your careers as journalists during Trump's first term. I think that was a unique relationship between the president and the press, to put it mildly. Emily, if you want to kick us off, what did that look like? What did that feel like? You were, I think, a newly minted reporter down in Trump's first term. Did that seem different or distinct to you?
I'm so lucky that I was never technically just a reporter. I've always been on the opinion side. I say that because, it's actually a lot more difficult to be shoe leather all day, every day.
Yeah.
And it's never been the role I found myself in. But at the Washington Examiner, Federalist, I was mostly on the conservative side. And that was interesting because the frustration on the right, actually a lot of it started to percolate during Trump won because people were looking at Trump's particular affinity for Maggie Haberman and Politico, where he would call up, or the White House would call up. I think it was somebody like Reince Priebus. He's not calling up the Daily Caller, right? they would call up their friends in, quote, the media, big media, corporate media, definitely not conservative media, and dish out scoops, dish out house intrigue. That's probably the biggest difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is there's been a significant, it's the best way to put it, decline probably in palace intrigue stories. Part of that is just people aren't leaking. And the other part of it is that some of these scoops actually have gone to, quote, conservative media, but also other places like the Free Press. Probably better to say new media in this case. So when we ended up seeing, I think it was Vivek Ramaswamy calling out Ron McDaniel at a debate in the primary election, that started with Trump 1, where conservative media was looking around and saying, we're growing. You're ignoring us. Republicans are ignoring us. And that started to change the relationship a bit between conservative media and the GOP.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Haisten, does that check with your
I
experience?
still feel like they're giving a lot of what their scoops out to basically mainstream. And not maybe as much as in the first term, but I know that's a frustration I used to have when I was at the Washington Examiner. As a conservative outlet, we weren't necessarily getting as much access as other people were at Bloomberg or whoever it might be. So still happening. I think it's closer maybe than it used to be, but not all the way.
When there's less like sniping, I think part of this is the palace intrigue thing. There's less sniping back and forth where someone is trying to knife Steve Bannon, and so they're going to call Politico to do it, right? So there's less of that. They've really locked down lower level, mid level type staff leaks, and so it's mostly just. I mean, it's actually a remarkably tight ship compared to Trump 1.
Totally.
Oh yeah, night and day, I would say on that front.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things about Trump 1 that's so important in this conversation is I think it shaped a lot of the president's perspective on the media and what they're capable of and what they're doing and how they feel towards him and how they're trying to enact the ways that they feel about him. So I think one of the biggest sort of differences that we're starting to see in Trump 2 is that the way he confronts the media is really different. Haisten, you wrote an excellent piece for our magazine Commonplace about this. How far is too far on Trump's media pushback? Do you want to talk us through a little bit what your thinking was here? I know this is a story that you've been kicking around for a long time, something that you've been really focused on. That not only did Trump not do this in the first term, but the way he's doing it in the second term maybe is going overboard, or at least there's the threat it could go too far.
There's the possibility, yeah. I'd like to lay a bit of my background, just for context here.
Sure.
I'm coming from a very different place than Emily for my background. For one, I was in Georgia for a lot of my career. I've always been a straight news reporter, not an opinion person until very recently. And I was, sorry, that's my train of thought there for a second. Sorry.
Yeah, straight news reporter. I think one of Emily's points is that when you're on the conservative side, you can kind of talk about the ecosystem of the thing a little bit more. And I think when you're a straight news reporter, it's a very difficult job. I worked for an organization that I think held a neutral bearing, but was seen as conservative. And I was a staff writer, right? The famous title that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the shoe leather journalist type, right? I think you were a fully a fully hardline reporter, right?
Yeah, and sorry, but also trying to thought there. I was a mainstream, basically, outlet. I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as a freelancer, for the Washington Post as a freelancer. So I've only recently been in the more conservative ecosystem. It's very, very different. So that was part of where I'm coming from.
And Georgia had a very fraught time.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I covered the election there, did a lot of stuff with the Post at that time. I was on staff, I was a freelancer, but still was working for them quite a bit. So I kind of come from both worlds here. I'm almost like bilingual, I guess. Which I think is reflected a bit in my piece. When I came over here, I kind of see things from both perspectives. The conservative side thinks this, the traditional mainstream side sees that. So the origin of this piece, this goes into, I spent 4 years as a White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. And again, saying this from both sides, I actually pitched this particular story in my job interview with Orrin Cass. I guess it's okay for me to say this, before I got the job I have now. And he was interested in it right away. He wanted me to write it, and I said, okay, I'll do that. So what I got here, I think, was what I tried to do was a balanced view here between the Trump administration on one hand and the WHA on the other, the White House Correspondents Association. And I think it got a lot of interesting reactions, not all of them positive, which is totally fine.
Yeah, and I think it draws heavily on your experience sitting in the room, right, Emily? I know this is something you've done as well, but Haisten, talk a little bit more about what it was like to be in the White House press pool and what like both the feeling in the room, but also being up, like, having the front row seat to the interaction between the press, something you were a member of, and the president.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting there is the contrast between what it was like in the Biden years and the Trump years. Again, I wasn't there for the first Trump years. I only knew the Biden administration. So, at first you're thinking, well, this is what the White House is like. This is what White House coverage is like. Sure. What I saw in the Biden administration. Well, of course, that couldn't be any different than what I'm seeing now or what I saw after Trump got back in office. Biden, everything was very scheduled and buttoned down. Everyone kind of sat in their assigned seats for our briefings and raised their hands and that kind of thing. With Trump, it's much more open, much more of a basically a free-for-all. They've invited a lot of new people into the briefings, so there's like a standing room only aspect to their briefings. A lot more people in there, just a lot more spontaneity as far as there's people out on the driveway giving interviews, things like that. So it's a lot more loose, I guess. But certainly they are also a lot more aggressive in their treatment of the press. They're much more critical, openly critical, and so that plays out a lot differently.
But I think it's also fair to say, and Emily, I'd love to pull you in on this too, because I have a feeling you probably share the sentiment that during the Biden years, it wasn't just that the Biden White House team was less hostile towards the press, but that the press wasn't particularly hostile towards the Biden White House, and that there were a lot of stories. Right, I remember back when I was at the Free Beacon there. The Biden White House basically put out an order to the media saying, "Hey, stop! You're pushing Trump's talking points by raising a certain set of questions. Like you have a responsibility to the truth and to honesty and to all these other words are just paper over. You are our water carriers. Your job is to do the things that we think are our shared view of what the truth is." And to me, I think one of the I've written a little bit about this for Commonplace and in other places, but I think one of the real alarming components, one of the real dangerous components of this was when Biden's cognitive decline started to become apparent. You've got a guy who is not taking press avails, something I know we've talked a lot about. He had no interest in talking to me. He had no interest in talking to anyone. Right? Emily, do you think that's fair? I mean, it seems to me like the media was deliberately disinterested in this story.
Yeah, I mean, we're learning more and more about what was happening behind the scenes, so I think it was fairly obvious as people were watching it in real time, but we've seen some reporters come out and just discuss how difficult it was to even try to report on Biden's health. So it was a push and pull, just like every administration's relationship with the press is, but this was way more pushing from the Biden administration than there was pulling from the press, which on such an important story we all saw why that was such a critical lapse. There's really no excuse for it, even if you're being bullied over your access by the White House.
And so let's talk a little bit about that bullying, right? Because Haisten, I think you have an excellent piece that dives into some of this. And I think for some people, that it strikes you as odd or aberrant or bad that he's doing some of these things. Emily, does it strike you that way? Are you concerned about the pushback? Are you concerned about the ways the White House has communicated about press access and press avails and who gets to travel with the president?
In the big picture front, I share a lot of people's concerns that just all of the norms we shattered in 2015 and 2016 as a country, but particularly Donald Trump himself and then people who followed and became supporters of Donald Trump here in Washington, I absolutely share big picture concerns about what it means just to have that level of hostility, threatening broadcast licenses, those types of, like, all of those concerns I think are entirely fair. So like big picture, 30,000-foot view, yes. On the other hand, I maybe one area, and this we could probably talk about more, that I disagree is what happened with the WHCA, the White House Correspondents Association, and when the Trump administration, this was genuinely shocking. It probably shouldn't have been shocking, but we've just never seen anything like it. The Trump administration essentially took over the WHCA's role as Haisten writes in this piece. And I think members of the public don't fully understand what that's meant. It's meant the Trump administration could basically shut the Associated Press out of access because they said they didn't want to say Gulf of America rather than Gulf of Mexico. Now remember, this is an organization that decided we all had to refer to men as women suddenly, I think that was 2014. And AP style goes throughout the entire country. It doesn't matter if you're the Associated Press in Cairo, Washington, D.C., New York, or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, wherever you are, if you follow AP style, you're suddenly putting your thumb on the scale on a massive issue. And so I just don't see any, I mean, it's like it's one of these mini tit for tat conversations in Trump world where for me so long as the media remains free and able to ask questions, which we're still seeing right now. Donald Trump would never cut off access to the press.
Yes.
He would
A very good
starve
point.
and shrivel up if
Right.
he couldn't talk to journalists.
Very good point.
The White House talks to press all the time. I was just at the White House the other day, and reporters were chattering about how accessible the White House is to normal members of the press, because someone in the foreign press was asking. I mean, the relationship is actually fairly normal between staff, like the people who handle the day-to-day wrangling and that sort of thing, and reporters. It wouldn't seem that unusual back in 2015 if you just sort of parachuted in. Some of the big picture structural scaffolding is obviously different, but the Associated Press taking a little chip from the Trump administration. I'm not really crying about it, to be honest. Not that you are, Haisten, but yeah, to Drew's question.
Sure, that makes sense.
What do you think, though? So, Haisten, I know throughout the piece, you talk right in the byline, there's a line to be drawn, right? Where do you think the line is? Are there things that the Trump administration is doing, whether it's with the White House Correspondents Association or in other places, some of the lawsuits, where he's beyond the line? Is he kind of tiptoeing up to the line? Where are we in that context?
Yeah, I mean, my concern is with the things like the lawsuits, threatening broadcast licenses, things like these are private organizations at the end of the day, right? So if you're walking into threatening a private organization, what they can do, that's where, to me, you might be abridging freedom of the press, freedom of speech. That's where I get a little bit iffy on this. I have to push back on what you might say.
Yeah, and I think
that's fair.
And I think some of that too is the kind of deep conservative sentiment about the press, right? Setting aside the fighting and the back and forth, there is something conservative, and I think you point out repeatedly in the piece about respecting those sort of things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We see sort of frivolous lawsuits tossed at media outlets all the time, and we've also heard one thing that has genuinely concerned me on the right, because I think it's sincere, is getting away from New York Times v. Sullivan. And as a journalist, and I've talked to others in conservative media who have flirted with this idea before, which is basically sets the defamation standard for when you have a legitimate case of defamation, is that this is, I mean, if you get rid of this, you have no idea what's going to come for conservative media, for conservative influencers, this is such a Pandora's box that, like, yes, well, you have the administration, maybe this is, or when you feel like you have the cultural momentum and the power, it feels like a great way to hit back at the press, but it's not a bit of toothpaste that goes back in the tube very easily at all. So I think some of that stuff I agree. The media did not, this is very compassy actually, the media didn't have to capitulate to Donald Trump on those lawsuits. They were ridiculous lawsuits. Like George Stephanopoulos did something reckless and wrong. That, as bad as what he did was, I don't know that it actually would have succeeded.
And a big part of that is because of New York Times versus Sullivan, right? Like when we think about the kind of the legal architecture, when you're looking at a malice definition, it is an enormously high bar to prosecute anything tied to a media organization if you bring it to court.
Right.
If you settle it because you want the case to go away, all that thing.
And you don't want discovery and all of that. Then again, they didn't have to capitulate. And so at the same time as I think, the Trump administration, of course it's Donald Trump, he's Roy Cohn's mentee, he throws lawsuits at the wall like he's Jackson Pollock. So I get that. He does that. Also though, as a journalist, I look at ABC, and we've seen so many others, like Kreml too, and it's like, you guys don't have to do that, but you're trying to buy back goodwill in this mafioso-like way with the president. Not that it takes away from him being mafioso-like. It's just them trying to take a shortcut instead of improving their institutional, structural problems. They're just trying to take a shortcut to pleasing Trump. And it might work.
Yeah, absolutely, it might. Hey, so where's your money on? I don't think you're a betting man, but when it comes to how the media will respond to these kind of lashings, right? Because I think that's, in a lot of cases, what Trump does. He lashes out at the media, he throws these frivolous lawsuits. I think you make a good point that, like, actually this is bad, this is wrong, this is weird, right? Setting aside the kind of reality TV of it all, these are bad developments in the relationship between the press and the American president. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, like I say in the piece, there's kind of a line to be drawn. The question is, where is that line, right? How far is too far? Where should the line be drawn? I mean, what do you think on that? What would be too far to you, I guess? Well, the line hasn't been crossed yet, so where would the line be to your mind?
I mean, I personally, I guess it depends on what capacity. I personally wouldn't govern or speak like Donald Trump. It's so far over my line that I don't even totally know how to answer that. But over my line for how to treat the media, I don't think broadcast licenses should be threatened to be yanked unless there's like a really high bar being met. Definitely. Trump has exceeded that. He tweets about that all the time. He says it. I don't think he's serious at all. But unless you build a substantive case about how ABC is not operating in the public interest, which you could make a case about Jimmy Kimmel, but that's one line. Like, we didn't see a substantive case being mounted. We saw a pretty cursory, and I like Brandon Carr, but I think a lot of that actually came from Nexstar and Sinclair, and the pressure that they were applying on Disney, and not so much from the FCC. But
sure.
This one line in a Jimmy Kimmel monologue is not the same as saying, ABC, you have done X, Y, and Z over the course of the last decade.
Right.
This is not in the public interest. Then you go to CBS. If you want to go to Fox Broadcast, go to Fox Broadcast. Talk about what's been on Fox News Sunday and say how they're not in the public interest. You can do that, but that's obviously not what was happening. So, I mean, there are definitely things that are like over the line. But with Trump, this is part of the big picture macro question is, people will ask that question on all kinds of different issues. What's over the line on tariffs? Because we all get all the time. What's over the line? Is Oregon? What's over the line on Venezuela or whatever? But for me, it's almost like I don't know. I literally don't know where to draw lines anymore because I don't know what the ramifications of any of this are going to be until Donald Trump leaves office. And it's a really annoying place to be in, and you still have to do your best to set what are principled arguments together. It's tough, but yeah.
That's a great point. Did you feel like you know what the lines were before? Is this a new development, or is it always tough to live through history because you don't know what the how the books are going to put it years later, right?
Well, I mean, I think it's totally new post 2015. He was shattering norms in ways we haven't. Basically, for me, the question is: after Trump is no longer in office, do some of the good norms return?
Right.
And are some of the bad norms, like there were bad norms, and I think one of those examples would be Republicans relying wildly on establishment press outlets. Bad norm. So I hope it doesn't go back to that. But do some of these good norms, like, I don't know, not freezing out media outlets because you decided to rename the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know if we ever have to deal with that again post-Trump. Maybe we get President Oprah, and we do, but maybe we don't. I mean, maybe things calm, at least in an institutional sense, in some ways that are good and bad. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing about the APE not changing the name with the Gulf and then being kicked out of the press pool. That's something that concerns you, think? And do you think the WHCA should be deciding who gets to be in the press pool or the White House? Because I can see both sides of this one.
I'm so down on the WHCA. I have a totally different opinion on the WHCA. I think they've completely abused the privileges that they were granted. I somewhat agree with the Ari Fleischer quote in your piece, which is basically that the press secretary should control who is in the room, but that's also just a norm, right? Without the WHCA, you end up with a norm, and who's to say, I mean, Donald Trump loves talking to everyone. Who's to say President Ron DeSantis says only the conservative outlets that are, like, favorable to me are allowed in the room? So, like, I think that's obviously tough, but at the same time, the WHCA was already doing that because they were run by a bunch of liberals. Now, they weren't doing it, they weren't kicking out the Washington Examiner or wherever.
Sure.
They were making life a lot harder for smaller, newer outlets. They weren't being very good stewards of the privileges that they had vested in them for a very long time. And frankly, their outlets were doing what I would argue was just a horrible job covering the White House, to the point where media trust is once again at its tied for its all-time low that it hit in 2017, which is remarkable that after the host of Celebrity Apprentice wins the presidency, and the press is shocked, he defeats the former Secretary of State. We're 10 years past that, and we're at the record low. Because if anything was going to fix trust in media, it would have been the host of Celebrity Apprentice,
Yep.
becoming the president, and it only got worse after that. We had
Yeah.
Russian collusion, we had lawfare. I mean, it's just been
Yeah,
So-
and Hasten, I want to pick your brain a little bit about this one because I think that's one of the things we haven't talked too much about on this conversation, but that there was so much that setting partisanship aside, there was so much that the press did to Trump for years. Whether it's Russian collusion during COVID, right? I think was another like a huge moment for decline in the press. As someone who was part of the WHCA,
Yeah.
how could they have done that different? How should they have done it different? Do you think it's fair to say that they really did blow it on press trust? Because I think whether whoever's responsible for it, it is hovering at these all-time lows.
It's a great question. I guess I feel like there are perverse incentives either way. If the WHCA decides, and they have their own biases they're going to put in this, right? They're going to have liberal bias. Like I wrote in my piece, there's 7 seats in the briefing room, 7 rows of seats, I should say. The first 3 rows get almost all of the questions, certainly in the Biden era. If you were behind the first 3 rows, good luck, right? And I looked at it, the first 3 rows, there's Fox News, and there's 21, well, most conservatives, certainly conservatives would consider left-leaning outlets, right?
Yep, right.
So how is that fair, right? But if the president decides, you have this other perverse incentive, right? If someone asks the president a question he doesn't like, does he kick him out, right? Do we get a Democratic president coming in and saying these right-leaning outlets are disinformation, they're dangerous, they're spreading hate, whatever they might say, and kick all of them out, and we had only liberal press in there. Right? So there's perverse incentives either way. I did have a thought of the polling thing as well. One thing that's very interesting, I was looking at before we got here, trust in the media. It was actually very high in the 70s when you had Walter Cronkite and that kind of thing. But that was really before the internet, where if you were watching ABC, if you were on ABC, you were extremely powerful, right? There were only 3 TV networks, you had your local papers, no internet other than that. And then with the advent of the internet, trust and press actually goes way down. So that's interesting. Were we exposing what was already happening, or why did that happen? I don't know.
Well, I think, if you go back decades on the right, there's pretty significant evidence that this had been happening, but for me, the best book about media that has nothing to do with media, this is right up your alley, Hasten, is Coming Apart by Charles Murray, which talks about elite sorting patterns over the last couple of decades, where the super zips, disproportionately where these newsrooms, their employees live. So they're clustered around Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles.
Sure.
Even places like Atlanta, very wealthy suburbs of Atlanta, where probably some people who have, their say at Gannett or whatever over the local paper. And we've seen people who are disproportionately college educated and upper income cluster in these professions now, and media is one of them, let alone live around other people who are much more similar to them, background and all of that. And Murray documents how that has such a vast cultural footprint, how that has been a change. I think part of it is that it's just a change we haven't adjusted to, and we haven't fully reconciled that this has happened, so we haven't started adjusting for our own class biases in a way that we absolutely really, really need to start adjusting for our class biases. And so that, to me, is where the media gradually started to lose more and more trust, and then Trump just ripped the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, he just blew a hole in the thing that was already bad.
And then he just ripped it off.
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of that too, I think a lot about blinders, right? And the blinders that people in the media have as a result of class bias, educational bias. Hasten, as someone who's worked for a long time in state level and local media, and then came to DC and got to spend a lot of time with the national press. Do you see the issues of focus and the things that reporters are talking about and focused on being distinctly different in those two environments?
Yeah, it's so much different. It really is night and day. And going back to polling, trust in local media actually is still pretty high. People will trust in the Constitution or whatever, whereas they don't trust in national media as much. There's actually, I think, a good reason for this. When I worked in Atlanta, the number of journalists compared to the percentage of the population, it's very, very low, right? If you're a journalist, you're kind of a big deal in Atlanta.
Sure.
Because everyone wants to be in the press, and it's hard to do, right?
Yeah.
In D.C., it's totally the opposite. There are tons and tons of journalists per capita here. And so that creates different impetuses, I guess. If you're a reporter, you really want to get the scoop, right? And so you are more basically subservient to the news makers in a way that you are not in a smaller market. And so does it make you less trustworthy? I don't know.
It's the power balance.
The power balance is totally different if you're at the local level versus the national. Also at the local level, if you just kind of write the story in a general way, You've done a good job. In D.C., you have to do something kind of extra to stand out from the crowd, and I think that creates incentives as well that always accrue to the benefit of the people reading the press.
Yeah, I think that incentive, particularly to be the first one to get the story in DC, is a huge part of the problem. Because in an era where, these media outlets rely on clicks, they rely on ads, they rely on the kind of what is the thing that comes up to the top of the Facebook or the X algorithm, it pushes, I think, a lot of reporters and a lot of people to talk about events and things and people, particularly President Trump, in ways that are going to capture the most people to click on them. And I don't think that's a good way to do journalism. And I would imagine that's not as apparent at the state level because you don't have those same incentives.
Clicks are still pretty important, I would say, yeah.
Fair.
Well,
That's a little bit different, yeah.
well, so one of my college internships was in the marketing department at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And
That's why you mentioned them earlier. I was like, oh.
Well, that's where I'm from. But anyway, it's stunning to walk. The building, I think, is now like luxury condos, but it was sort of stunning to walk through. Literally a dusty printing press in the basement. They rebooted they did an Office spinoff called The Paper that started recently, and it's been very bad when I watched. But it was crazy, like eerie, my exact experience of walking into this like once august institution, and literally I was grabbing like decorations off of the dusty printing press, and it had been so hollowed out. But at the same time, you could see how the business incentives in the local press, part of what I was doing is telling people that they won the weekly Brewers sweepstakes game or whatever it was.
Okay,
$100.
right.
And that endeared them to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in a way that, it's such a beautiful testament to the power of localism and the health of those incentives that have a paper that's part of a community, responsive to a community, and the pipeline from local media to national media, that was like Haisten's path.
Yeah, right.
That should have been, there's no world in which I should have just been able to take a job at a nonprofit out of college, and then a couple of years later end up doing opinion writing at a national publication.
Yeah,
but it's normal now.
Yeah.
And so like that is a broken part of we still haven't adjusted to the fact that people don't spend time in these smaller metro areas, rural areas before coming to, first maybe it's Nashville.
Sure.
Then maybe it's a bigger market. Maybe they go to Miami.
Yeah.
And maybe they go to Washington or New York. And so the death of local media, I think, has absolutely contributed to declining trust in, quote, mass media, which is what Gallup asks every October. We're about to get those numbers up.
Yeah, right. And I think a big part of that, too, is that the pipeline, you mentioned this, the pipeline for reporters gets cut off, right? You don't have the, shoe leather journalist experience as someone who's covering the local crime beat in Winnetka, Kansas, right? You don't have those kind of experiences, formative experiences as a journalist. I didn't either, right? I didn't have that local experience. And I think there's this oversaturation of opinionated people, right? And I think I am very much one of those opinionated people. But it dilutes, I think, the quality sometimes of journalism.
The lack of empathy too is
Yes.
really big. That, if you've never lived, so if you go, you're from a nice suburb of, maybe it's Atlanta, and you go to Emory and then move to Washington and start, at the Post or wherever. Or you start at a smaller paper in Washington, you just never have that empathy. It doesn't connect in the same way that if you spent years grinding it out, going to school board meetings. That's one of my pet theories, is the school board wars of 2020 never would have erupted if local press had first been in a lot of those school board meetings where it would have been diffused on a local level before it blew up into national news. Now everything immediately goes national if it's interesting in the national press because it's not hashed out before it's explosive. Where otherwise you kind of litigate that in the community. Somebody sees an article about the curriculum changes at the local school.
Sure.
They show up at the school board meeting. They talk to the other parents physically, face to face. They see them. Usually it's okay. They come to some type of resolution. Maybe it's over months or weeks, but it doesn't end up in a fist fight.
Yeah, right. And I would imagine it's the inverse of that is kind of calcifying, right? If you go in and all of a sudden it becomes a national story because look what this school board did about kids in bathrooms or whatever the issue is, right? Kids in sports. It becomes the sort of thing where if you really want to blow up your issue, you really want to get at least attention to it, if not a solution. It's not, I'm going to go to my local paper. It's, I'm going to go to the Daily Caller or the Daily Signal or Fox News and say, look what is happening. Isn't this preposterous?
Right.
Which does a really good job of blowing it up as preposterous I don't think it does a particularly good job of actually deriving any sort of solution.
Certainly, because if it runs straight from the local level into the Daily Caller and Fox News and whatever, it's going to get extremely nationally polarized very quickly. You're not going to have a conversation from that point. You're going to have a lot of PR firms getting involved, basically trying to wall things off. Yeah, at the local level, right? If it's in the local paper, there might be a mini controversy within the town that could be resolved in different ways. So I don't know how you solve that. What you do, how we bring back the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel if we do to a greater state of prominence, but it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, and I think that the collapsing influence of local media is a huge problem in all of this, because if you had an institution like the Sentinel to be able to go and say, hey, look at this thing happening, and really dedicate the time and energy to cover it, not as clickbait, not as rage bait, not as a really good tweet, to say, hey, here are the things that are happening, here are the forces pushing. I wonder if then, even if it gets picked up at the national level, it's framed differently. Emily, do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair. 100%. And part of this is the desperation that people, because local newspapers, now that they're not, I don't know if disproportionately is the right word, but they're owned by Gannett, they're owned by these big companies. So maybe if you had, a metro area outside of the big city in your state, you end up getting your news from that state, if you're or from that city, I'm sorry. And sometimes it is actually across state lines, like closest major city. And a lot of that is just coming out from the wires. It's just like local sports, and they're just so understaffed that actually there's a huge problem where it's centralized. And a local paper, yes, it's a local paper, but how local is it compared to what it used to be?
Right,
That's a huge challenge, I think, going forward. So I hope that more innovative little media companies spring up, because I think what that creates is this desperation that conservatives, let's say around Milwaukee, feel like they can't go to the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel with this story. Let's say it's 2018. They're not going to go to the Journal Sentinel with a story about a trans bathroom controversy. And in fact, I know at my high school that happened, and it just was blew up into a national story. But where do you go with that without risking significant personal ramifications if you are a parent? And this happened to parents that were not conservative at all.
Right, or even political at all.
Yeah,
and so I wonder. I want to talk a little bit. I don't want our readers to be too downtrodden about the state of the media. That is
I
the
do.
spirit. And that's our. Maybe even before we jump into that, one of the things Haisten and I were talking about on the way over is what should conservatives want for the media, right? What is the good outcome here?
Yeah, that's a question I'd like, to hear Emily's thoughts on, because, I think we can all agree, I certainly agree with this, that the media is biased, right? The legacy, the bigger outlets are definitely left-leaning. Even the local outlets are still basically left-leaning institutions, right? So how big of a problem, though, is this for Republicans, right? Even if they are biased, the Democrats are not doing very well right now, right? So there's clearly not that much of a benefit to what they're doing. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? How big of a problem is this, or is it something that's not that big of an issue?
I think it's increasingly less a problem for the right, but I actually have a fairly clear vision of what I think it should look like, which is basically you could fix the Washington Post and New York Times overnight by just having them come out and say, this is not just a bias on our editorial page. We are a group of left of center writers, disproportionately left of center values, and we think that's okay, and we're going to be honest with you about that. Because I think so much of the tension and the distrust now is that there's this remaining pretense of neutrality. And I think if people who are, I know some people who are capable of genuinely being neutral, of calling balls and strikes, and are great shoe leather reporters. There are so few and far between, and I think that's perfectly okay. We have this myth of what media looked like after the post-war period, basically, in the post-war period, where mass media technologically had just burst forth. So TV, radio, and for a long time the advertising model prized. The example I always use is Colbert versus Carson. This explains media, and they're like, why was Stephen Colbert, for Trump 1, the top-rated host in late night, despite getting 3 million viewers compared to where Carson was getting 11 million nightly? And the answer is, he was the most political and most partisan. Carson was political, but he was never partisan. And Colbert was partisan because he was chasing a niche. He cornered that niche market. And I think as long as you're honest with your audience about the fact that you are now doing a Clapter Resistance Wine Mom show, but you know what and you're not trying to be Johnny Carson, that's what pisses people off. That's what grinds their gears.
I
That's
see.
what makes them
They do it, it's
detest you.
dishonest. So the problem with that, I think, is if you're the New York Times or the Washington Post, these are people who genuinely believe that they are being objective.
Yeah,
They
totally.
think that they're calling balls
Totally.
and strike. They genuinely believe that. And so what do? You tell them that they're not calling balls and strike, but they don't believe you. So this is definitely a big thing. These people, they were at the WHCA. That's one reason they were so upset, because they genuinely believe we're finding the best outlets we can possibly get to put it here at the front. So I like what you're saying. I almost think of we talk about the yellow journalism was like the late 1800s when you just had this sort of openly, nakedly partisan press. I think it's actually a decent model, and as long as you kind of know which ones are left-leaning or right-leaning or favoring whichever party, you can kind of get a well-rounded view. But I guess if they're not willing to admit that they're espousing those viewpoints, then where do you go with that? I don't know.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the problem. I mean, Jeff Bezos was the steward of the Washington Post and had a very different take on Trump,
Yeah.
and was very supportive of the democracy dies in darkness model.
Right,
Yes,
right,
that was
right.
his whole thing, I think. I think he came up with that.
Right, but what's so interesting to me about that is Bezos at the time didn't say, well, we're turning the editorial page into a pro-American, free markets, free people type of page, which he's done now.
Right.
And that is fascinating because he was still trying to hold that fig leaf of institutional neutrality over the Washington Post.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yep.
And that's, I mean, like, I actually am very sympathetic to my leftist friends who have this, like, Chomsky critique of
Yeah.
mass media during the Reagan era. I mean, the way that J. Edgar Hoover manipulated reporters and had them just complicit in his anti-left operations.
Right.
Like, that's, those complaints are completely fair. It's not just that mass media is left of center. It's just, from my perspective, it's just complete class bias.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I wonder too if a little bit of the conversation is kind of lacking that historical context of like what is actually the real bad corrosive relationship between the press and the administration or the government. And I think it can look like a lot of different things, and I think your class point is well taken.
Yeah.
I'm curious about so let's say the New York Times, the Washington Post, I'm sure they would have mass exoduses if they were to do this and say, hey, look, we are a group of left of center writers. We believe this. I think a
We
lot of
saw
people.
it in their editorial page.
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos said
Right.
we're going to be free market,
Right.
that kind of
They
thing.
were like,
So
nope.
people-
And so tons of people leave. Which, you know what? Fair. Fine. You want to go to Substack? You want to do something else? Not going to hold
Well,
it
and,
against
and
you.
you don't want to be controlled by a billionaire.
Right, right.
As a
Which
journalist, fine.
completely
Even if you're
reasonable.
a libertarian, fine.
Right, right.
It's just like, well, first of all,
Right.
don't be libertarian.
I don't know I'd go that far, but fair, broadly, I think fair. But
Yeah.
is there anything that remains that can call itself the caller of balls and strikes? That there is a neutral outlet, and I wonder, downstream from this, does it force the type of people, like the really good people at the AP, the really good people in the New York Times, to kind of come together and say, in like a almost free press sort of way, to say, hey, look, we all share this sentiment, and there's an interest here, right? Is that a market, a corner to capture, or is it not, and that's okay?
I think it's not, and that's okay. I think there are individual reporters who could, so like I think Jonathan Swan, great example. Like he can call balls and strikes. He can be just passionate and an excellent reporter. The New York Times overall is not an institution that's prepared to do that now or in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think a lot of that is just downstream of class. Like it's not to me like, ooh, they just hate Republicans.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're fomenting violence against everyone. Like they think that they're genuinely, as Haisten said, they genuinely think they're being neutral, but they have some blinders on that they. Quick story.
Yes,
Super
please.
quick. I spoke at the Society of Professional Journalists a couple of years ago, and it was on a panel that was basically like it's talking about how dangerous conservative media is, like new media is.
Perfect, yep.
And I was the only
you can go
person
on the
from.
panel.
Yeah, and you are the sacrificial lamb. I can see it.
I was working at the National Journalism Center at the time, so I felt like it was fairly important. And so I went there, and one of the questions in the audience, I gave this exact same spiel about coming apart and all of that. And one of the questions in the audience was, like, how do you have a leg to stand on? You just said that you have lived in a big city for 10 years. You went to a fancy school, not that fancy, but a fancy school, and you work in the media. Like you have. What are you talking about? Like you're just as bad as the rest of us. And I looked at her and was like, yeah, I know. That is why you should have someone here who, like, you need to cut the middleman out.
Yeah,
like,
right.
go right to the actual people.
Right.
But they won't because they have this, like, inability. And I think we're seeing this actually play out politically right now, but just this, like, fundamental inability to, it's this, like, taste snobbery.
Yeah.
Like, anybody who doesn't talk like them, act like them, they don't trust.
Right.
And I think that some of the hot take, some of the opposition to Charlie Kirk posthumously has come from just having this sense that he talked to like an average person, and
Right.
distasteful and anti-intellectual. And
Well,
so,
that's part of what shocked them, right? And yeah, this piece that I wrote came out before the Kirk assassination. We've certainly seen interesting ramifications after that. I think the memorial service they held at the football stadium in Arizona, right? And it was very religious, very churchy, very familiar to me as someone who grew up in Georgia, right, going to church. But yeah, a lot of people we saw online were like completely shocked by this. What is going on here? This is not appropriate. There was the one tweet saying, "I feel more at home in Greece than it would at an event like this." Yeah. Even though it was at a full football stadium, this is like a very, very mainstream thing. But like you're saying, there's a class issue, I guess, there that this is totally foreign to them.
Right.
Well, I like Thomas Chowder Moons, and I thought that was a great post actually because it was really helpful to see this. I think he's a New York-based writer say this feels like a different world to me.
Right. He was at least open about it.
Yeah, right. There's an honesty to it because I do think a lot of the reporting downstream from those class biases is almost like anthropological.
Yes.
Where you have these reporters who go to these places they've never heard of and don't understand, and they walk around as if they're in like at the zoo or in space, and they see or they're like unearthing the bones of an ancient civilization to say, oh wow, isn't this curious? They talk like this and they do this thing. Yeah, right. And I think it really I think it is honest, it is forthright, and it captures the distinction between the people doing the talking and the subjects of the reporting and the conversation, the discourse.
Dean Paquette in one of the New York Times' struggle sessions after the 2016 election turned around in the newsroom and said, "We don't get religion."
Yep.
And then we saw the outpouring of just, I would say, really unfortunate coverage after what happened to Kirk. And it's again, this I just come back to like this has been 10 years, and it doesn't seem to have improved. It seems to have gotten worse.
Yeah. So it's gotten worse. I want to close on this. Is there a way to make it better? Haisten, do you think there is, like, are we reaching the bottom and maybe we'll bounce back? Are we reaching the bottom and we're entering into something else that's different and maybe it's okay?
I think I'm fairly cynical on this. I guess my most optimistic take on this is that we're almost re-entering the era of like yellow journalism. Because there are so many outlets, it's so easy to access any alternative outlet you want to access. And so, yeah, I think it's more just be open about it, right? This is the liberal outlet I read, this is a conservative outlet I read, and we get there by reading both of them, basically. So that's where I come. We're not going to necessarily get better per se, but at least there's a lot of variety now that you can easily get to.
I'm like surprisingly optimistic on this actually. Like this has been a very doom and gloom conversation, but it's doom and gloom about the institutional press and legacy press. But I think they're suddenly getting this new rush of competition from new media, and I'm talking about left-wing new media and right-wing new media. Like there's great new shows that are super tough on Democrats that are liberal hosts, and same thing goes like new media on the right. Tough on Republicans. That really started in the Tea Party era. So I think this competition is healthy. I think it's great that those outlets are keep competing with each other. And so I'm weirdly optimistic, more optimistic than I've ever been about the media as a whole, because I think suddenly you're starting to see better coverage from the Times on like trans issues or whatever. But I don't think they're ever going to restore their neutrality. But I think that competition might start nudging them, like the Washington Post, to be a bit more honest about where they're coming from. And overall, I just think the growth of new media, Substack, YouTube, whether it's left or right, it's just becoming so much more robust, and it's supplementing people's media diets with the old institutions. You still have to get your reporting from Kyiv in the pages of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Like these new media outlets don't have outposts there. Right, so you can kind of compare and contrast, and I just think we're headed toward not a perfect system, but a better one.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think a big part of that is that by introducing that competition, by bringing in those outside voices, if the Times isn't going to welcome them into the newsroom, so be it. Somebody's going to carve off. Emily, to your point earlier, they're going to find those angles, those niches, those kind of corner communities of people who are interested in this thing, who are going to, Haisten, to your point, they are going to try and run down their left and right coverage, and they're going to find it. Because it's going to be out there.
Yeah. What I'm cynical about, I guess, is the idea that we have like polling that comes out. They said that October will come out showing trust in the media. I think it's going to continue to be basically low. If people say anything about the media, it's going to continue to be way down. We're not going to get back to the 70s. when those numbers were up much higher. So, for better or worse.
I also think we're in a period of low institutional trust.
Yep.
Generally, the reason that I'm a journalist is I don't trust power. And
Yeah.
I think the American people are skeptical of power generally, and historically have been. So I don't worry too much about trust in media being low in and of itself, but declines where then it doesn't ever get back up to like anybody trusting anything. That's not great. But there's going to be a lot of snobbery in the years to come from institutional press here at DC about like random influencers, and I will probably share in some of that snobbery, but some of it will be unwarranted and just sort of fear of competition.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end it on. Emily, Haisten, thank you both for joining me. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.